Marcus had always believed that some roads were meant to be avoided. As a child, his grandmother would point to certain stretches of highway on old maps, whispering warnings about places where the asphalt seemed to breathe and the telephone poles leaned too far toward the center line. Now, at 28, he found himself behind the wheel of his grandfather's sedan, heading north on Route 138 despite every instinct screaming at him to turn back. The car had been stored in the garage for 3 years, gathering dust and spider webs, but it started on the third try that morning. The engine's rumble felt familiar, almost welcoming, yet as the miles stretched behind him, Marcus couldn't shake the sensation that the road itself was watching his progress. He checked the rearview mirror for the 100th time, half expecting to see another vehicle following him, though the highway remained empty. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too vivid, too theatrical for natural light. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as the first shadows began to stretch across the pavement like grasping fingers. It began as a flicker in his peripheral vision, something that might have been a trick of the light or a smudge on his glasses. But as the darkness deepened, Marcus realized he was not alone on the highway. Figures began to appear along the shoulder, standing motionless in the beam of his headlights before vanishing into shadow. At first, he told himself it was fatigue, the combination of driving for hours and the hypnotic rhythm of the road playing tricks on his mind. But the figures became more distinct, more numerous, until he could see them clearly through his windshield. They wore clothing from different eras, some in business suits from the 40s, others in tattered dresses from decades earlier. Their faces were pale and gaunt, eyes hollow, and fixed on his car with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Marcus pressed harder on the accelerator, the engine roaring in protest as he tried to put distance between himself and the watchers. Yet no matter how fast he drove, they remained visible in his peripheral vision, always just beyond the reach of his headlights, always keeping pace with his vehicle. The rational part of his mind screamed at him to pull over, to call for help, but something deeper, more primal, urged him forward into the darkness. The highway had transformed into something beyond mere road and asphalt. Each mile marker that passed seemed to drag him deeper into a realm where the laws of physics bent and reality became negotiable. The ghostly figures had multiplied, spreading across both shoulders of the road like a macabre parade. Some ran alongside his car, their feet barely touching the ground, while others appeared to float just above the pavement. Their faces twisted in expressions of anguish and desperation, mouths open in silent screams that somehow Marcus could almost hear through the glass. He glanced at his speedometer, watching the needle climb toward 80 miles per hour, yet the distance between himself and the pursuing spirits seemed to shrink rather than grow. The road ahead stretched endlessly into darkness, punctuated only by the occasional rusted sign that warned of dangers ahead in faded lettering. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory, speaking of family legends and warnings never to drive this particular stretch after dark. The old man had been right, Marcus realized with growing horror. This road was cursed, and every mile he traveled bound him more tightly to whatever malevolent force called this place home. The ghosts were not merely watching him now, they were reaching toward the car with translucent hands, their fingers brushing against the glass with an otherworldly cold that made his breath fog the windshield despite the warmth of the cabin. The hands came first, pressing against the glass with an insistence that made Marcus' heart hammer against his ribs. They appeared without warning, dozens of translucent appendages with elongated fingers that seemed to stretch impossibly far toward his vehicle. Some wore tattered gloves, others bore rings that caught the dim light from his dashboard, but all shared the same purpose, the same desperate hunger that emanated from beyond the thin barrier of safety glass. Marcus slammed his foot harder on the accelerator, the engine screaming in protest as the speedometer climbed past 90. Yet the hands kept pace, multiplying until they covered every inch of his windows, blocking out the road ahead and transforming his world into a nightmare of pale flesh and grasping digits. He could feel their cold seeping through the glass, a supernatural chill that made his breath visible in the warm cabin air. The rational part of his mind screamed at him to pull over, to stop the car and assess his situation, but terror had taken control, overriding every logical thought with the primal urge to flee. His hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white against the leather, while ghostly fingers traced patterns across his windows like morbid artists painting their desires in frost. The road beneath his tires seemed to stretch endlessly forward, yet he could no longer see where he was going, trapped in a cocoon of supernatural horror that pressed against him from all sides. The faces began to appear inside the car itself, materializing from nothingness with a malevolent purpose that made Marcus' blood freeze in his veins. They emerged from the dashboard, from the back seat, from the very air around him, pale and gaunt visages with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through his soul. Their mouths moved in silent screams, lips stretched impossibly wide in expressions of eternal anguish and hatred. Marcus pressed his face to the windshield, desperate to escape their gaze, but found more faces waiting there, pressed against the outside glass like voyeurs at a window. The supernatural chill that had begun to permeate the cabin grew stronger, making his breath come in visible puffs despite the heater running at full blast. His hands trembled on the steering wheel as he fought the urge to simply stop the car and surrender to whatever force had claimed this road. The speedometer needle quivered near the 100-mile mark, yet the miles seemed to stretch backward rather than forward, as if he were driving in circles through some hellish loop. The faces multiplied with each passing moment, filling every available space in his field of vision until he could no longer distinguish between reality and nightmare. Their hollow eyes watched him with an intensity that spoke of centuries of accumulated rage and disappointment, and he realized with growing horror that these were not random spirits but the tortured souls of others who had made the same mistake he had made, who had driven this cursed road and paid the ultimate price for their curiosity. The engine died with a sound like a final sigh, and Marcus found himself sitting in absolute silence in the middle of the dark highway. The car had simply stopped, as if the very road itself had decided that his journey had gone on long enough. He turned the key in the ignition repeatedly, but the engine refused to respond, leaving him trapped in a cocoon of supernatural malevolence. Outside, the ghostly figures had stopped running and now stood in a perfect circle around his vehicle, their translucent forms illuminated by his headlights and the pale light of the moon. They wore clothing from different eras, some in period dress from the early 20th century, others in more modern attire that still seemed dated and out of place. A few carried old-fashioned lanterns that cast eerie shadows despite producing no visible flame, while others leaned on walking sticks or held their tattered hats in skeletal hands. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic flashing of his hazard lights, which seemed to pulse in time with his racing heartbeat. Marcus realized that he was no longer moving through space and time but had become a fixed point in some cosmic equation, a target for the accumulated rage and despair of all those who had come before him. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, yet he knew with absolute certainty that turning around was no longer an option. The ghosts had claimed him, and his car had become a shrine to their eternal vigil. In the suffocating silence of his trapped vehicle, Marcus remembered his grandfather's journal, buried somewhere in the glove compartment among old receipts and faded photographs. His hands shook as he rifled through the cluttered interior, papers and documents spilling across the seats as he searched for anything that might explain his predicament. The leather journal was exactly where he remembered it, its pages yellowed with age and filled with his grandfather's careful handwriting. As he flipped through the entries, his eyes widened at the accounts of similar journeys, of other family members who had driven this same cursed road and encountered the same supernatural guardians. The journal spoke of a tragedy from the 1920s, of a bus accident that had claimed dozens of lives and left their spirits trapped between worlds. According to his grandfather's research, the ghosts were not malevolent by nature but were bound to this stretch of highway by their unfinished business, their desperate need to warn travelers away from the same fate that had claimed them. Marcus' heart raced as he read about rituals and offerings that might appease the spirits, about specific phrases that could convince them to release a traveler from their eternal vigil. The pages crinkled under his trembling fingers as he searched for the key to his salvation, knowing that every moment he delayed might be his last. Outside, the ghostly figures remained motionless, watching his frantic movements with patient inevitability, as if they had witnessed the same desperate search countless times before. The journal's pages revealed secrets that made Marcus' skin crawl with understanding. His grandfather had documented not just the tragedy but the pattern, the way the spirits operated with a cruel intelligence that transcended death. The bus accident of 1923 had been no ordinary crash but the result of a supernatural force that fed on fear and despair, drawing victims to this particular stretch of road like moths to a flame. The ghosts were not random apparitions but guardians of a cosmic trap, their eternal duty to ensure that no traveler escaped the highway's grasp. But the journal also contained hope, carefully recorded rituals that could break the cycle if performed with absolute precision. Marcus read about offerings that could satisfy the spirit's hunger, about specific words of acknowledgement that could transform their malevolence into something approaching mercy. The photographs scattered throughout the pages showed the same highway at different points in history, always with the same ghostly figures standing sentinel along the shoulders. His grandfather's notes spoke of successful escapes, of family members who had managed to appease the spirits and continue their journey, though many more entries detailed failures and their tragic consequences. As Marcus absorbed this knowledge, he felt the weight of generations pressing down on him, the accumulated wisdom and terror of his bloodline converging in this single moment. The ghostly faces pressed against his windows seemed to lean closer, as if sensing his growing understanding, their hollow eyes reflecting an intelligence that transcended their undead state. The decision crystallized in Marcus' mind with the clarity of desperation. He would not spend eternity trapped in his car like some cosmic exhibit, a warning to future travelers who might stumble upon this cursed stretch of highway. The journal had provided him with knowledge, and knowledge was power even in the face of supernatural horror. He opened the car door slowly, deliberately, stepping into the swirling mist that rose from the asphalt like the breath of something ancient and malevolent. The ghostly figures shifted closer, their forms becoming more distinct as he emerged from the relative safety of his vehicle. Their clothing from different eras created a timeline of tragedy, each spirit representing another victim of the highway's hunger. Some carried old-fashioned lanterns that cast dancing shadows despite producing no visible flame, while others leaned on walking sticks or held their hats in skeletal hands with an air of patient inevitability. Marcus raised his hands in what he hoped was a gesture of peace, his voice shaking as he began to speak the words his grandfather had recorded. The mist swirled around his ankles like grasping fingers, and he could feel the weight of their collective attention pressing down on him like a physical force. But he had made his choice, and retreat was no longer an option. The words came haltingly at first, stumbling from his lips as he read from his grandfather's journal with the ghostly figures leaning closer to hear. He spoke of acknowledgement, of respect for their eternal vigil, of understanding that their presence was not born from malice but from duty to warn the living away from the highway's trap. The spectral forms shifted and swayed, their hollow eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that seemed almost hopeful. Marcus could feel their attention like a physical pressure, but it was different now, less hostile and more curious. He continued reading the ritual phrases, his voice growing stronger as he realized that the spirits were listening, truly listening, for the first time in decades. The journal spoke of offerings, of specific items that could satisfy their supernatural hunger and convince them to release a traveler from their grasp. As he spoke, the mist around his feet began to thin, and he could sense the highway itself holding its breath in anticipation. The ghostly figures gestured to each other with translucent hands, their movements creating whispers that sounded like whine through dead leaves. Some pointed toward his car, others toward the road ahead, and Marcus understood that they were debating his fate with an otherworldly council that transcended time and space. His grandfather's words had awakened something in them, a memory of humanity that had been buried beneath centuries of supernatural duty. Understanding flooded through Marcus as he realized what the spirits truly wanted. They were not monsters or demons but souls trapped between worlds, their humanity slowly eroding beneath the weight of eternal duty. He reached into his wallet and pulled out the photographs that had traveled with him for years, images of family members who had passed away, faces that spoke of love and memory rather than fear and despair. The wedding ring that had belonged to his grandmother, the letters from his grandfather that spoke of hope and dreams, these were the offerings that could bridge the gap between the living and the dead. He arranged them carefully on the car's hood, watching as the ghostly figures drew closer, their translucent forms bending over the offerings with expressions of recognition and longing. The mist swirled around the scene like a living thing, responding to their emotional state with an intelligence that transcended natural law. The spirits reached toward the photographs with translucent fingers, and Marcus could see tears forming in their hollow eyes, tears that fell upward into the supernatural air like reverse rain. They recognized these faces, these connections to the world they had lost, and in that recognition, Marcus saw the humanity that his grandfather's journal had promised still existed beneath their supernatural exterior. The road behind him seemed to shimmer with possibility, while the spirits whispered among themselves in voices like whine through autumn leaves. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable, like watching a storm system dissipate under the influence of some cosmic force. As Marcus continued reading from his grandfather's journal, the ghostly figures began to fade, their translucent forms becoming increasingly transparent with each passing moment. Their expressions shifted from the hollow intensity of eternal guardians to something approaching peace, even gratitude, as if his offerings and acknowledgement had released them from a duty they had grown weary of performing. The supernatural mist that had surrounded the car began to thin and dissipate, revealing the road ahead for the first time since his journey had begun. The ghostly hands that had pressed against his windows withdrew, and their whispered conversations faded into silence. Marcus felt a weight lifting from his shoulders, a pressure that had been building since he first saw their faces materializing along the roadside. The journal spoke of completion, of the ritual's power to restore balance between the living and the dead, and he could feel that balance returning to this cursed stretch of highway. The hazard lights on his car continued their rhythmic flashing, but now they seemed less like distress signals and more like beacons of hope. On the horizon, the first pale light of dawn began to appear, painting the sky in shades of gray and gold that spoke of new beginnings rather than eternal night. The spirits raised their hands in what might have been farewell, their forms dissolving into mist that swirled upward like smoke from a distant fire. The car started on the first try, its engine rumbling to life with a sound that seemed almost celebratory after the supernatural silence that had preceded it. Marcus slid behind the wheel with hands that still trembled, but now from relief rather than terror. The ghostly figures had vanished completely, leaving only swirling mist that was rapidly dissipating in the growing light of dawn. The road ahead stretched clear and visible, no longer shrouded in supernatural darkness but revealed in all its mundane reality. He checked his mirrors compulsively, half expecting to see translucent faces watching him, but found only empty highway and the first hints of morning traffic in the distance. The journal lay open on the passenger seat, its pages rustling in the breeze from his open window, and Marcus wondered if what he had experienced was real or the product of exhaustion and imagination. But the photographs were gone from his wallet, and his grandmother's wedding ring felt lighter on his finger, as if some cosmic force had taken what it needed to restore balance to this cursed place. The highway stretched ahead of him now with the promise of normalcy, of distance and safety and the simple pleasure of uneventful travel. As he put the car in gear and began to drive forward, Marcus caught sight of his reflection in the rearview mirror, and for just a moment, he thought he saw other faces looking back at him from beyond the glass, faces that smiled with gratitude rather than hunger, before dissolving into the light of a new day. The sunrise painted the world in shades of gold and amber, transforming the cursed highway into nothing more than an ordinary stretch of road connecting distant points on a map. Marcus drove forward with the confidence of someone who had faced the impossible and emerged victorious, though he knew that victory had come at a price that would echo through generations. The countryside rolled past his windows in peaceful normalcy, farmers already working their fields and birds singing in the trees that lined the road. He checked his rearview mirror one last time, but saw only the receding distance and the memory of supernatural terror fading with each mile marker. The journal remained open on his passenger seat, its pages now silent after their role in bridging the gap between worlds. Marcus wondered if other travelers would encounter the same spirits, if his actions had permanently broken the highway's curse or merely provided a temporary reprieve until the next curious soul stumbled upon this stretch of road. The thought made him drive faster, eager to put as much distance as possible between himself and the place where the dead had walked among the living. But he also felt a strange sense of connection to his family's history, to the generations of travelers who had passed this way and left their mark on the supernatural landscape. The road ahead stretched toward normal destinations and ordinary concerns, yet Marcus knew that he would never again view any highway with the same innocence, knowing that some places existed where the boundary between life and death grew thin as morning mist. From above, the highway appeared as nothing more than a thin ribbon of asphalt winding through an endless landscape of fields and forests, indistinguishable from countless other roads that connected distant points across the country. Marcus' car was barely visible, a small moving dot that grew smaller with each passing moment as he put distance between himself and the supernatural encounter that had nearly claimed his soul. The sun blazed overhead in a sky free of supernatural clouds, casting shadows that fell in natural patterns across the road and surrounding countryside. Birds flew overhead in formation, their songs carrying on the wind without the whisper of otherworldly voices mixing with their melodies. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, toward destinations that existed firmly in the realm of the living, toward concerns and connections that belonged to the world of flesh and blood rather than spirit and shadow. Marcus drove with the steady rhythm of someone who had rediscovered the simple pleasure of uneventful travel, his hands relaxed on the steering wheel as he navigated toward destinations that no longer seemed shadowed by the possibility of supernatural interference. Yet he knew that some roads carried memories that transcended the physical realm, that certain places existed where the veil between worlds grew thin enough for the curious or desperate to glimpse what lay beyond. His grandfather's journal had prepared him for such encounters, and now he understood why the old man had been so insistent about avoiding this particular stretch of highway after dark. The landscape rolled past his windows in peaceful normalcy, but Marcus knew that appearances could be deceiving, that the most ordinary-looking roads sometimes hid the deepest secrets, and that some journeys were worth taking only if you knew how to survive the destination.